The Center of the Cyclone, an Autobiography of Inner Space by John C. Lilly, MD. And this is a continuation of Chapter 1. During the nap, I became recentered back into the space of the room. I awoke and went to the bathroom. I was about to close the door to urinate when I suddenly saw that one of the hang-ups of civilization is closing the bathroom door. I started to laugh uproariously at the pure and unadulterated humor of the closed bathroom door. I left the door open and went ahead and peed. My guide asked what the laughter was about. I was now moving off into other places and couldn't even answer the question, so she didn't press it. I then looked into the mirror at my own face, and I saw multiple projections onto my own face. I first saw myself as I was at that time, and then in flashes, occurring about 1 per second, I went through my self-images. I went through many of my self-images, hundreds of them, some of them very old, dating back to my childhood. Some of them apparently moved forward in time, showing me as I would be at 90, completely wrinkled, very old, and desiccated. Others showed me when I was sick, blotchy images with purple and other unpleasant colorings on my face. Some of the images were of my idealized self. I appeared as if a god at times. At other times I appeared as if a cripple. The positive and negative flowed into the projections. Out of my storage banks, I suddenly saw how one could literally project visual images out of memory. At this point, I decided to use this power, and I projected my father's face onto mine, and then his father's face. And I continued backward in a sequence of new faces that I believed to be my ancestors. Every second a new face appeared. I pushed back through, I would estimate, 2,000 generations, and suddenly the face of a hairy anthropoid appeared on my face. My humor came to the fore at this point, and I said, "Oh, you can project anything, including the Darwinian theory of the origin of man." I started to laugh, enjoying the spectacle. Suddenly, the face of a saber-toothed tiger appeared in the place of mine, with 6-inch fangs coming out of his mouth. A very friendly tiger, but nonetheless a so-called dangerous saber-tooth. At this point, I suddenly saw that one had a choice of interpretations here. This could be something dredged out of my unconscious, some threatening thing from the past, or it could be my idea of what the anthropoid's dangers were. This could be a racial memory. This could be an imagined thing based on my previous knowledge. Or this could just be an event that had no contemporary model to explain it. Since I was on a high, I thoroughly enjoyed this experience and elaborated it further. I didn't stop to explain to myself what was happening. I watched it happen, and as soon as I would think of something new to happen, it did happen. It was a really joyful use of my intellect and knowledge. I found that I had used up a good deal of my energy, and I went back on my bed, lay on my back, closed my eyes, came back to the present with my guide, and then I started off on a trip back through memory. I lived out many of the scenes of my childhood, happy ones, satisfying ones, playing with my playmates, being suckled by mother, being back in the uterus, floating in empty, wonderful, ecstatic space, surrounded by light. I became smaller and smaller in the uterus, going backwards in time, until I was the fertilized egg. Suddenly, I was two. I was a sperm. I was an egg. Time reversed, and they suddenly came together. There was a fantastic explosion of joy, of consummation, of completion, as I became one and started to go back through all the embryonic stages. I went through my birth, experiencing the shock of leaving that wonderful, safe place, of coming out and being unable to breathe, gasping, suffocating with the pressure of the uterus expelling me. When my guide saw that I was suffering, she understood what I was going through and she let me go through it. She said later that I had to re-experience my birth and understand it. She didn't interfere when I was gasping, but she did watch me very carefully. She watched my color and she made sure that I wasn't going to push myself too far. As I came through out of the birth canal into the light, I gave a tremendous gasp. All the choking and pushing was over, and I was clear. I rested, breathing quietly, feeling all of the new feelings coming from the stimulation of my skin and eyes. With my guide's cooperation, I relived the first nursing experience. I opened my mouth and something warm came into my mouth, something soft from outside, a really beautiful experience. I came back out of that space and into the room again, lying on the bed, smiling happily, peaceful, after all the storm and drama. My guide described me as looking more peaceful than she had seen me in years. The trip lasted exactly 8 hours, because that was my expectation from the literature. Later I found that my expectations had turned off the acid effect at precisely the expected time. Thus I learned about self-meta-programming. In other words, one's own beliefs pre-program to a certain extent what happens when one is under acid. After 10 years of work in the isolation tank, I had made a generalization from my experiences in the tank. Let me state this as simply as possible. What one believes to be true either is true or becomes true in one's mind, within limits to be determined experimentally and experientially. These limits are beliefs to be transcended. This is the situation when one is freed up from one's environment, from one's surrounding reality, and all of the usual forms and patterns of stimulation are attenuated to the minimum possible level. In stepping back into ordinary consensus reality, I almost regretted having to leave the LSD space. I was fatigued by the massive outpouring of energy that had gone on. I seemed to have been operating at 10 times my normal speed. Now I needed sleep. That night I slept like a baby for 12 solid hours. I woke up feeling thoroughly alone, integrating and observing what I had been through. Grokking in fullness waiting is. Grokking in fullness waiting is. And that's a quote. And there's a little asterisk here, and it says, Robert A. Heinlein, Stranger in a Strange Land. So it's a quote from Stranger in a Strange Land. I remember that as being a wonderful book. It is absolutely essential after such trips to have at least one day, one full day alone, observing what went on, and if possible, writing up or dictating what happened for later reference when one wants to refer back to that first trip. This writing or dictating has two major benefits. One, it keeps one oriented during the secondary period coming after the primary phase of the LSD effect itself. One has about 3 days to a week after a session in which to absorb it, to grok it in fullness, to make it part of oneself. Any activities on that second day should be kept to a minimum. There should be no responsibilities or commitments so that one can absorb what happened during the LSD state. In a sense, an LSD session can be metaphorically called a pupation period, Pupation P-U-P-A-T-I-O-N, pupation period. The caterpillar forms the cocoon and then proceeds to total reorganization as a pupa. Pupa? Pupa. Not sure how to pronounce that. P-U-P-A. Only after a period of apparent disorganization and reformation can the butterfly form. After the butterfly is formed, it must rest and realize its being as a butterfly. It has moved from a crawling existence to a flying existence, and before it can fly, it must become dry, allow its wings to spread and form itself. The LSD session itself is the pupation, the period of organized disorganization, in which things are moving around with a fluidity and a plasticity that one normally does not experience unless some direction is put into this process of pupation. One can be uncertain as to how one will come out, still a caterpillar or some monstrous combination of caterpillar and butterfly, or as a butterfly. In my experience, the day after the session is quite as important as the session. Directed, self-disciplined movement is necessary on that second day. If one is the sort of person who is willing to do it, it is best to be alone. If not, be with those who have your goodwill, who have heart for you, who believe in you, who want to see you evolve, and who can help you evolve. Possibly, the ideal thing is for the guide to be available when needed that second day, in order to discuss points that you may want to discuss. But you still lead during this. The guide does not lead under these circumstances. The guide can point out, can be a fair witness to you, can give you information about what was happening outside while you were going through this internal space. It is useful and sometimes very necessary to know what was happening outside while you were launched into some of these strange spaces. On the second day, I spent a lot of time free associating and trying to pin down where the experiences had come from. I had heard about the transcendental, mystic, religious experiences written up in the literature of LSD. I had been skeptical of these as a scientist and an explorer, and yet I had gone through one myself. How was I to explain this? How was I to fit this into me and make it part of me? It was apparently a real experience of going to a real heaven and experiencing religious fervor and devotion, something I hadn't experienced for years. On the second day, I was able to go back through memory and get to the period of my childhood when I believed in the Catholic Church. Suddenly, I began to remember that I had had visions very similar to the experience under LSD when I was a little boy, preparing for confession in a darkened church. I was kneeling facing the altar. There was a single candle lighted on the altar, and the rest of the church was darkened, with very little light coming in from the outside since the windows were high up. Suddenly the church disappeared. The pillars were shadowy, and I saw angels, God on his throne, and the saints moving through the church in another set of dimensions. Since I was only 7 years old and had seen paintings of artistic concepts of God, this is what I saw in the visions. I also saw his love, his caring, and his creation of us. With this opening up of my memories, which had been repressed during my adult years while pursuing scientific and medical careers, I suddenly saw what I had gone through with the LSD had been a highly energized, extremely positive experience that somehow had been pushed out of memory in my adult life. I found that I was reluctant to put down the experience. It was recent, highly positive, highly valued, and somehow this apparently was happening as some sort of a lesson for me. Either it was all happening inside my own brain and I was remembering what had happened in childhood, or something else was happening, something farther out. Suddenly I realized that I couldn't explain the childhood experience or the LSD experience so patly. Suddenly I found, from over-explaining anything about this experience, I fully realized that my childhood and my adult experience were practically identical. The experience may have been brought in from memory and lived through once again because it had been repressed. However, there seemed to be more to it than just that. One could put down a child of 7 and say that he had been fed programs of the visions of saints, of Saint Teresa of Avila, that the mystical aspects of the Catholic Church had been thoroughly programmed into this young man, and that he was projecting his visions totally. I then remembered that I had made the mistake of confiding in a nun that I had had this vision. She was horrified and said that only saints had visions, putting me down thoroughly. At that point I repressed the memory and that kind of experience, but before I repressed it, I was angry, so she doesn't think I am a saint. Coming back to adult life, I laughed. When I discovered all this, I saw that I could project from storage even ecstatic, transcendental, mystical, and religious experiences. I made a sudden leap forward and I realized what a beautiful mechanism we are. But I was still left with no real explanation. No satisfying explanation for either experience, the first one or the re-invoked one. I tried putting it down in Freudian terms, saying that the first vision was a wishful thinking construction of a childhood imagination, and that the second one was merely a reliving of the first experience. In one sphere of my thinking, this was satisfying. In another, it was not. I had had other experiences 4 times when I was close to death, which had said, "This is not all there is." Continuing my integration and exploration of the second day, I went back into one of those close-to-death experiences. As a Catholic child, I was exposed to death. When a relative would die, we had to view the body, attend the funeral, and go through the usual Catholic rituals having to do with death. I was thoroughly acquainted with the concept of the soul leaving the body of the person at the time of death. Also, I had imagined in the privacy of my own bed as a little boy my soul taking off and winging towards God and heaven. This also turned out to be a preparation for that first LSD session. When I was listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, I literally left my body and went to heaven, just as I had wished to do and had done in dream states as a little boy. I kept reminding myself, in the province of the mind, what one believes to be true either is true or becomes true, within limits to be found experientially. Later I was to realize that the limits of one's beliefs set the limits of the experiences. At the limits of one's creative imagination, whatever that is, there are a set of beliefs yet to be transcended. The learning process is on a vast scale. As soon as one learns of one's beliefs, one can transcend those beliefs. One's beliefs are then more open, and a new set of beliefs is formed, and with the new set of beliefs beyond those. Now let me read that sentence again. One's beliefs are then more open, and a new set of beliefs is formed, with the new beliefs beyond those. The original beliefs are included as a subset. My mathematical training in set theory began to operate, and I realized where I had been at each stage of my life was determined by my beliefs at that time. Each set of those beliefs became a subset in a larger set as I moved on and increased my knowledge and experience. During the second day, I suddenly began to remember things that had happened, which I hadn't written up earlier. For example, I remember projecting a face onto my body in the mirror. When one sees this corporeal or body face projection, one suddenly realizes that one did this as a child also. If one stands opposite a full-length mirror so that one can see the whole body, one can imagine that there is no real head there in the mirror. The top of the corporeal head is the shoulders, and then the nipples become the eyes, and the umbilicus or belly button becomes the nose, and the pubic hair becomes the mouth. In the male, the penis hanging down is a tongue hanging down out of the mouth. In the female, the tongue is inside. One can project all these things onto a face once one sees it. It can look like a face of an idiot if you are on a down trip in regard to your body. It can look like a very happy face if one is content with one's body. It can look like a sexually aroused beast if one is putting down one's sex but is sexually aroused. When I saw this on my own body, I turned and I looked at my guide, and I saw it on her body. The eyes that were popping out were the female breasts. The tongue was missing from the mouth. As I watched, she suddenly became a golden goddess, a fantastic beauty. As I felt the excitement and longing with that picture, suddenly it shifted. The emotion changed to fright and panic, and she became a female ravening gorilla, covered with hair, dripping from her genitals with mad sexual desire of a bestial sort. My guide saw my fright and saw that I was projecting something from my dark negative part onto her. When I told her that I was projecting the female ravening gorilla, I had turned in on a very dark part of her, and she identified with my projection. She had reacted to my projection with her own hang-up in this area and had let me have it. She had been taken in on my trip and reflected my emotion with anger that I should project on her whom I loved with such a horrifying image. We started the two-mirror oscillation effect, each projecting on the other and each further projection causing the other to appear with negative enhancement. I learned that one has to deal with hang-ups in one's guide as well as one's own hang-ups. I had to come back out of the LSD state and deal with my guide's upset at that point. I reminded her that this was my projection, not hers, and that she had agreed not to get involved in my trip. A lot of emotional tension developed between us. She quickly came out of this negative state as I described the other image that I had projected on her. We then discussed the polarity of my view of women. Because of my childhood religious training, I pictured women as either remote goddesses or angels with no sex whatsoever, or dangerous sexually seductive animals. This split in my view of women was so obvious at that point that on the second day I had to spend a lot of time working that one through. I finally associated with women who had been in my life. I had started out by projecting a goddess image on my women, making them more than they possibly could be. or anybody could be, in terms of purity, virtue, and all the positive qualities. Later, having accomplished the sexual act with them, and having experienced orgasm with them, having experienced their orgasms, I demean them as having given in to their animal nature. This was straight from the teaching of the Catholic Church. Again, it was a projection into real situations brought forward in time from my past. I had been taught that sexual impulses, anger, and so on were part of one's animal nature and were sinful. Carnal desires were to be put down, controlled, in order that one could become a saint. This split had taken place quite early in my life, and I was still carrying it around at the time of that first LSD session. In spite of a lot of analytic work, the analytic work that I had done in my psychoanalysis with Robert Vailder, Waelder, had uncovered enough material so that I could see this split in action during my first experiences with LSD. Probably I wouldn't have had such freedom without that analysis. I might have identified with this negative projection and had a bum trip. I could freely experience the poles of my desires and idealism and the poles of my fright and horror because of this preparation. For the first time, I was able to see the extremely positive pole and the extremely negative pole between which my life oscillated. In regard to women, I had oscillated between the goddess and the gorilla. Obviously, I had sexual hang-ups to be worked on. I had ideals out of consonance with reality. I had fear-filled spaces within me, centering around sex, aggression, and threat. Later, I was to find the bipolar nature of the dichotomies in many areas of my existence, my being, and my knowledge. I felt after this review session that I could understand something from the beyond good and evil concept. My fair witness was developing. Each of us has within us a fair witness, observer that faithfully and objectively perceives and records what is really happening. I was on a high that second day, and the high went on for a period of 2 weeks. As a result of this prolonged high, I made another mistake. In the euphoria of these tremendous discoveries, and with the overwhelming self-confidence resulting therefrom, I was led into one of the LSD traps. I felt that I had mastered the knowledge gained during the LSD experience, but as it turned out, I had not mastered this knowledge. There was still more bad material to go through. There was still more nonsense programs in me to be brought to light. After this session, I took a real trip to Hawaii for the first time. I spent 10 days in Hawaii, continuing on the high and sharing my newfound knowledge with my friends in Hawaii. The experience of the tropical islands enhanced the high. I came back all ready for a second trip, thinking that the high would continue and that I could stay that way permanently. I undertook my second trip with the same guide in another location 2 weeks after the first trip. The circumstances were not so favorable as for the first experience. After the second session, I was due to return home to an unhappy family situation. This dominated the second session. I spent the second session preoccupied with my problems with my wife. I walked up and down the room, first berating her, then berating myself, trying to reform her personality along more ideal lines, seeing how I, too, could not come up to my ideals. I came down from my high during this trip and got into some very sticky areas, having to do with my performance in my 2 marriages and my lack of integration of a family life with my professional life. Thus, I learned that expectations also lead to programming of sessions. Where you are going after the session, what you are going to be doing then, can pre-program the session to the point where you live out certain expectations. Under these circumstances, you can go on a really bum trip. I worked through a good deal of very personal material having to do with my wife and my child and my previous wife and her children, and came to the conclusion of the real situation existing. And came to no conclusion of the real situation existing, no matter what I would imagine or any theory that I would construct. The facts of existence as I saw them could not be changed. In addition, I was under pressure of the pre-programming of a scheduled talk to a scientific society across the continent. The second session did not take place with the relaxed atmosphere of the first one. I was under pressure, and it came out in the session. I was so preoccupied with these matters and with talking to myself out loud into a tape recorder about them that my guide lost contact with me and went out into another room and left me to work out my own destiny. I did not go into any far-out internal spaces this trip. I stayed with the current problem, and I discussed it with myself and hallucinated real persons, getting them to give their side, and I gave my side to them. I came out of that session feeling rather hopeless about my marriage, about any possibility of changing my wife's mind, or her personality, or her knowledge. I did not have time to integrate the LSD experiences, to recapitulate and to grok in fullness that I had had in the first session, because the next day I flew across the continent. That night I gave the speech to the scientific society, and after I had finished the speech, I left the banquet room and I pushed the elevator button to go up to my room in the hotel. That's the last thing I remembered until I became conscious 3 days later in a hospital in that city. In the meantime, I almost died. I had been in a coma for approximately 24 hours and had been blind for 2 days. I literally did not know what was happening for a week. I lay in that hospital bed trying to figure out how I had gotten there. I could remember giving the speech, pushing the button of the elevator, and from that point on, there was a complete blackout as to what had happened. I could remember something about LSD. I could remember everything that had happened up to the point of pushing the button, so I knew I had my work cut out for me. Until my vision came back, I was in no shape to analyze or attempt to remember. I was fighting for my life, for my vision, for my whole future. After my vision returned, excuse me, and I was able to see, I then had time, 6 weeks of convalescent time, to recapitulate, to remember, to piece together what had happened to me. Once again, during that time, I was able to see that I had gone through another close-to-death experience without the expert medical and neurological care that I had received at the hands of my medical colleagues and friends. I would not be here today. My life was saved by the lucky happenstance of a friend finding me in that hotel room and getting me to the hospital where I was known and where there was a high level of neurological and brain competence. And that concludes Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is called Near Lethal Accident. No experiment is a failure. Till soon.